everyone. We are in session 6F. What if we radically reimagined assessment with Jessica Walker and Jiyoung-Ki Lim. Just wanted to introduce our speakers today. Jiyoung-Ki Lim is an assistant professor of strategic design and management at Parsons School of Design, and his practice spans launching new organizations in both private and public sectors to researching and teaching at the intersection of design and science. And Jessica Walker is an assistant professor of integrated design at Parsons School of Design. And her research has been supported by the NSF and the New York Community Trust and focuses on pathway development and increased access to STEAM learning through partnerships between community organizations and institutions of higher education. So welcome to our speakers and ready for our session.
Thank you so much, Kristen. It's great to be here. Can you guys hear me okay? Hope so. Kristen will let us know. So again, my name is Jessica Walker. We're very excited to be here to share with you some ideas, some learning ideas. We're very excited that we've been included in this conference, and we appreciate the conference team for all their work putting this together. Jiyoung-Ki, you want to say hi?
Wonderful seeing you all. I'm so excited that we're able to connect, and I look forward to our session together.
Great, thanks. So we are hoping today to share a little bit of an introduction to who we are and share some learning ideas, some prompts that we do in our own classes that focus on community building and assessment structures in our courses. We would love to frame the paper for you that we've presented as part of this conference. And then we have like an interactive kind of designerly activity for you to participate in if you feel that is something you'd like to do with us. So that's what we're here to do. And I'm going to share my screen and get us started, hopefully. Feel free to let me know, Jiyoung-Ki, if you don't see this.
I can see it. Looks great.
Great.
Let's do the full screen. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. So I kind of broke the rules already and slightly changed our title, but it's How Might We Radically Reimagine Assessment? And we're saying how might we because we designers often frame things in that language. But we thought we might start by just breaking down these three words to give a little bit more context for where we're coming from. We tend to think about the radical nature of this work because it's coming through a place of curiosity and inclusion, and perhaps assessment strategies haven't really always had that at the center. We think about this as reimagining because we come from the landscape of design, which means we have the muscle to flex around creativity and making, and so that's how we approach this work. We admire those of you who are data scientists, who are learning engineers. We want to call you into this reimagining process with us, the design educators. And we're thinking about assessment in a couple different ways. We are thinking about assessment because we really have a lot of trouble grading our own design students, our own creative students. Grading is one of those things we really grapple with in our practice as teachers. And we really want to think about validating and evaluating the joy of learning. And so that's a little bit about our framing. We want to give a very quick special thanks to our research assistants, Xiaofan, Vinay, and Kriti, who have been amazing supports through their brilliant minds. And also we want to thank our research support at faculty research support at Parsons. So in a true designerly fashion, we wanted to introduce our work to you through the practice of a mood board. So maybe if you're familiar with fashion design or other design practices, you might know about mood boards. But this is my attempt to illustrate to you visually some of the things that make up me, who I am. I'll reintroduce myself and say that my gender pronouns are she, her, hers. Some visual identifiers are that I'm white, I have brown hair, brown eyes. I'm joining from Brooklyn, New York, the unceded ancestral land of the Lanai Lenape people. This mood board is an attempt to show you kind of what I'm engaged in my practice, on the top left, you'll notice this kind of coupon style graphic. I am an educator in higher ed, but I'm very much interested in the pathways to higher ed and who has access to those pathways and how might we rethink them to increase equity and access. Some of that work takes the form of pre-college mentorship, rethinking admissions protocols, aligning our curriculum with community-based organizations at Parsons. So that's a lot of the work I've been doing in my research. I've been part of a National Science Foundation grant looking at micro-credentials, really how they support student resiliency, especially from students from underrepresented backgrounds. I'm also an illustrator. I illustrate children's books. You'll see the lower left there, there's one of my recent books. I direct the integrated design program at Parsons, so that middle bottom image there, you'll see my students celebrating their thesis projects. You can barely see the projects because there's so many people there. The students in the program I direct are creative entrepreneurs. They are interested in social practice and research-based making. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jianqi to introduce us to his practice.
Thank you, Jessica. Hey, everybody. Some of my work has been very if we're to think about the relationship between what we think about as an impact that we can create in conjunction with what are the ways that we can investigate those concepts to find a different way to be more effective. I think that has been kind of the thread throughout very much of my cross-industry experiences in my career. A lot of my works in the beginning of my careers has been in the public sector, from a service in the military to in city government in New York, along with the practices of how can we bring in the design practices into entrepreneurship spaces. So how can we think about design strategies and methodologies and research can actually create can foster a startup to be more meaningful. From there, a lot of the work has been expanded to focusing on how can we manage and position and management education at Parsons School of Designs and also at the New School. Along with some of my recent research work has been focusing on applying complexity sciences and agent-based models into simulating different scenarios that could be relevant for policy interventions and research intervention, along with engaging in mediums like virtual reality. So Kristen, our host here, I think she has a couple of things in common. And how can we think about those mediums to be effective in creating design fiction experience, another kind of design research methodology? So my recent work has been focusing on the impacts of AI as an application within educational settings and how they can foster a creativity. But all of these investigations and experiences really sums up to some of the key questions that I've been keep coming back to is the questions of assessment. And I think that's why I'm so excited to share some of the work that Jessica and I and the entire research team has been working on for the past year. Jessica, I'll hand it back to you.
Great, thank you. So a lot of what we're talking about today is how we set up a classroom, how we begin our engagement with learners. And those of you who may be from the education sector and others may be familiar with the concept of community agreements. So community agreements are also known as a group contract or a learning agreement, and they're really an opportunity to have a conversation with the people, your key stakeholders in the room, to talk about what makes them feel comfortable and confident and able to learn in the environment. So this image here you'll see is just a picture I took of one of my classes after we had this discussion at the beginning of our semester. And some of the things that they are bringing to the table are that they want us to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, for example, or creating a safe space. So these are the types of things you might think of as community agreements. And as a way, because it's Friday afternoon and we're at the end of this conference almost, and maybe some people just want to take a moment to reflect by themselves, We've brought you a quote from Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks is an American author, social activist who focuses on intersectional politics of race and gender and class. And this quote we found really, we think, speaks to the idea of creating community. And we thought maybe we'd just take a minute to silently reflect to ourselves what this quote might mean to you. So I'm going to read it and then just take a minute for yourself. You might take notes on your paper there, or you'll be invited to share those thoughts in the chat if you would like, but no pressure. So to build community requires vigilant awareness of the work we must continually do to undermine all the socialization that leads us to behave in ways that perpetuate domination. So maybe just take a minute to reflect. Okay, I'm flying a little blind here, so I'm not sure. If you want to use the chat, please feel free to do so. You can share any reflections or thoughts. When I think about this quote from myself as an educator, I often think about how I'm supposed to arrive to the room as an expert, when in fact I'm not an expert at all. And the community agreements exercise is a wonderful way for me to signal to my students a kind of openness or an invitation to participate in their own active creation of the learning environment. So whatever that quote might mean for you, we invite you to share it in the chat if you'd like. I'm going to move us forward to two other quick ideas, just as a way of framing classroom practices or how we might think about starting assessment practices on day one with building relationships with your students. So one thing I've experimented with in my studio is borrowing from the language of math. I ask my students on day one to write their own equation. And I'm asking them in my particular class, because I'm a designer, I'm asking them to solve for creative confidence. So I ask them to start with this: creative confidence equals. And from there, they have to create their own kind of equity-based, if you will, equation. So this is an example from a student from a couple years ago when I gave this assignment on the very first day of class, an in-class assignment. Creative confidence equals trusted colleagues plus time for failure minus self-doubt plus reflection. And so what I love about this as a practice for how you might think about assessment is really, again, on day one, opening up your vulnerability a bit to invite other learners in to participate in the creation of how you're setting ground rules. And there's something about like the absoluteness of math that when paired with kind of our social emotional needs, some people may be invited to come out of their shell and talk a little bit more using this kind of framework. Another thing that I've experimented with in day one of setting up a classroom environment, we all play icebreaker games, I'm sure. But this is something that I found myself doing on day one of teaching an online class, which I know many of us struggled with teaching online and, moving abruptly to online learning. In the case of design and hands-on activities, I was really feeling like completely lost. So on day one of this online course, I really wanted to signal to my students that we were still going to play. We were still going to be creative, and their voice and their input and their engagement was very much valued by me. So here's another example of us playing a game, Would You Rather, and they were moving their initials on the slide to indicate what they agreed with. So would you rather have an amazing prototype for a novel idea or have a mediocre final product, but with interested investors? So some interesting responses from Gen Z here. I was kind of surprised. Would you rather, by the end of the school year, have your project celebrated by the masses now with short-lived success, or be avant-garde now and celebrated in 25 years? But again, I think games for assessment, or how you try to set up day one, can be really helpful. This is the kind of the part of the radical thing that we find ourselves thinking about as educators, how we might bring some of these like low stakes practices, these creative, playful experiences to the assessment practice. Okay, so moving on, we wanted to talk just for a minute about the changing or not so changing landscape. We, as part of our participation in this conference, we have presented a paper under the same title, What If We Radically Reimagine Assessment? And we start off the paper thinking about the historical context, meaning that there hasn't been a huge amount of pedagogical change in assessment since perhaps the 1800s. So we thought we might use our own institution, Parsons School of Design, to help kind of illustrate this point through the visual that you see on your screen here. We went to our archives at the New School, and we found this image. And I guess I'd ask you to look at the image and ask yourself a few questions about this image. We see a class of learners. These are students, and they are gathered around a model for a fashion drawing course or a fashion drawing lesson. Many people may only associate Parsons with fashion, and here I am playing into that stereotype. We do lots of things at Parsons, but this is just for this example. There are some things we might not notice about who's in this room. What do you notice about who is drawing? And what do you notice about who is posing? And what are they wearing? And is there anyone in the room who isn't drawing or isn't posing? And in my read of this image, there seems to be one person standing. He's kind of obstructed by the model's hand. And he's looking over the shoulder of somebody who's learning to draw this model. So today's design studio might look a little bit different than this image we see from the 1800s. The ethnic backgrounds that make up the typical classroom would certainly shift dramatically, although they still would not be reflective of a level of ethnic, cultural, or social diversity that we would really want to see that's reflective of, say, New York City. But even with as like old-timey looking as this image is, I would argue that there's probably still many of the same assessment practices in place today at Parsons that are happening in this photo from over 100 years ago. Everyone in the room is looking and engaging in a single modal learning activity. There appears to be one evaluator, and that one evaluator is looking over the shoulder of one learner, and he's able to kind of engage with one learner at one time. And we don't really know, but how are these learners being assessed? They were probably getting letter grades, just like we give out today in our classroom. So in some ways, this image looks completely antiquated, but in other ways, we're kind of still doing the same thing. So this leads us and our research team to think about more how might we questions, because we only come up with questions at this point and not as many answers. But this really leads us to where we're going with our work. How might we explore participatory engagement and community agreements as assessment strategies that foster more equitable learning environments? How might we dissuade negative teacher bias, which we understand impacts low income and students of color at disproportionate rates? How might we promote a sense of community, belonging, and self-efficacy? These are the areas that we are most interested in thinking about through assessment. And how are we going to center inclusion or personal reflection by calling our students into the grading process rather than keeping it hidden from them? As we look around our own institution at Parsons, we might start to take note of some areas where other people are engaging in this work. This is certainly not an exhaustive list of things that are happening in this area of reimagining assessment, but it's just some things we feel are worth noting. Some practices include the democratic syllabus, where students are invited to co-create the syllabus in concert with the teacher. There's been a lot of work around decolonizing curricula. So for example, if all required readings are by white authors, there's clearly an issue with the lack of representation, and therefore a learner being assessed in that environment would certainly be experiencing some trauma. Trauma-informed teaching. Teachers show up to the classroom in an effort to support learners that meet them where they are, understanding that there are systemic traumas, personal traumas. Co-teaching is something everybody I'm sure is familiar with that, but we tend to be doing more and more of it at Parsons and the new school, where different perspectives, more support, more sharing in the teaching process happens. Flipped classrooms where students are learning at their own pace. Radical transparency, where we can clearly answer for our students, why are we doing this? And we give them an honest answer about why we've chosen particular things in the curriculum for them to focus on. Peer review, because we know that mentorship can come from many places, and peer review creates a sense of belonging and community. I've highlighted the last two because I believe this is where our research and our interests are most connected to this area. We're really, again, interested in community agreements and participatory assessment being guiding stars for how we set up our classroom experience. As designers, we are thinking about making things, because that's what designers do. We make things. We break things, we fail a lot too, but we make things. And so if you could imagine this slide kind of moving from left to right as a simplified evolution of assessment technology, very simplified. On the left, you have a grade book, and that grade book is really meant for a single instructor's grade keeping and assessment. And it's very hierarchical, it's numbers based, it's how an instructor might assess a learner. And then in the middle, you see an image from Canvas or Blackboard where there starts to be a dual view. We now know that there's a teacher, there's a learner who can engage with this learning system, and it's still numerically based. It's still assessment in the sense that it's a single evaluator evaluating a single student or a group of students. But in the future, might there be a technology that is transparent, open, and based on community input that wouldn't rely on one single evaluator as the sole decider of evaluation? What would that tool need to be like in order to be truly inclusive of many contributors or stakeholders over time? You could argue that you could hack Canvas or Blackboard to do this, but what if the technology was initially designed with those attributes at the center? So this is where we are with our research team. I've given you no answers and only questions because that is where we are. We are very focused on the inspiration research, secondary research, interviews phase of our work. We are drawing insights from things as far-ranging as the natural world. How do animals engage in assessment, and how do they share that in communities? Is it punitive-based? Most often we're finding no. How can we be inspired by, you'll see this image here. This is a sketch from another mood board. We talk a lot about recipe building, in this case, making a pizza together. What if assessment practices were like bringing different recipes and different ideas together in a community, and that's how we decided to assess one another. We talk about different ways of indicating measurement and what's happening in technology like the iWatch that measures your physical activity over a day and how motivated we are to close those rings. And things like social media. Why is it that young people or anyone is very interested in sharing their ideas and stories in these ways? And how do we assess them? What can we learn from that storytelling practice in this work? All this to say that we are very open at this moment to what might influence how we move forward. So I'm going to hand it over to Jiangqi, who's going to talk a little bit about the paper that we've shared as part of the conference.
Thank you, Jessica. So as you can see, as we're approaching this idea of how can we think about assessment in a different way and much more relevant today, the key aspects of this research is this is very much focusing on pedagogical intervention. What we're doing here is we're inspiring, gathering from a lot of different ideas and concepts and theories, but at the end of the day, this has to make an impact in actual classrooms. So the key aspects of this types of research activity for many of the learning scientists in the room is that we're very much focusing on this idea of a design-based research, that the things that we create is meaningfully affected. And of course, that design itself is a research-based, meaning that all different types of cross-disciplinary activities that we do informs what their form might be and go through the iterative processes. One of the evaluative framework that we're applying into these design artifacts are cultural historical activity theory that allows us to kind of look at the different aspects of that learning environment, whether it's a division of labor or collaborative dynamics among different types of stakeholders within the learning environment itself. So using these types of theoretical frameworks and research practices, we're putting into different types of hypotheses and concepts that we have identified as a research practice, a pedagogical practices that's relevant for this types of tools and learning environment. So here are 5 different kind of the key practices that we're incorporating. Number 1, as Jessica said, is learner-centered assessment is considered as an ideal pedagogical practices for these types of higher education. Number 2, participatory evaluation is meant to, just like this act itself, is empowering the participant. And I think we think that is critical as we're thinking about the conference's themes and equities and empowerment, giving them the decision power to the people who are oftentimes not included in the processes of assessment processes is critical for creating this kind of learning to be effective. Third aspect is setting an active learning goals for students can result in sustained motivation. I think a lot of different research kind of supports this hypothesis that we're walking into. And in order to create a fair and equitable evaluation practices, there need to accommodate a wide range of social and cultural backgrounds that's represented by all different students. And lastly, as we're examining these types of practices, one of the things has been coming out very strong in terms of how we can think about assessment differently is this concept of learning contract that kind of helps in the negotiation processes of different educators and students to develop an assessment together. So these things are kind of really conceptually and then theoretically influencing how we're approaching to this project itself. So Jessica, if we move to the next slide. So here's some of the quick snippets of different types of prototype we've been generating for this project. And I do apologize if you hear some car noises. I'm having some challenges today, so do bear with me for any crazy background noises.
We can hear you, Junkie. You sound good.
Thank you. I'm definitely conscious of the noises around. All Grade is one of the prototype we've been developing is called All Grade, as we're thinking about this assessment new way. And then All Grade as a tool is a online collaboration platform that prioritizes the inclusive practices as a key driver for determining the different types of assessment methods and goal and learning environment. And I can kind of quickly go through how this user experience can look like. And what you're seeing here, a couple of different slides here. One of the main things that we're thinking about this types of learning environment platform can do is invite different types of stakeholders in a classroom, whether it's a teacher, student, administrator, and parent, into this one, in this case, a virtual space. Within this learning community in the space, what we're trying to do is how can we kind of incentivize and visually intrigue them to co-create a very unique combination of assessment strategy, which that Jessica was referring to earlier as a recipe or pizza build. So starting from the left, what you're kind of seeing here is just different way we've been kind of brainstorming on this idea and then showing it to different stakeholders within the research. It's an idea based on kind of a marketplace where possible assessment strategies, whether that is a peer review or standardized testing, self-reflection, teacher evaluation, or portfolio making, different groups of learners and different stakeholders within the learning community can able to actually look at these assessment methods. They can click on it, they can learn more about this different assessment method that could be relevant and resonating to that group. From that point on, they can drag and drop those assessment methodologies. So that group is able to co-create a assessment recipe based on these choices. And then once those assessments kind of blocks into places together, they can kind of apply different weighing in and rubrics of how much we want to emphasize. Maybe the standardized testing for this algebra class, we want to put that around 40%. But the peer reviews and reflection that can go into evaluating how the critical thinking applies to different problem solving, we want to build it up to around 50%. So these types of determination can happen within the platform by individually students and teachers are sharing their assessment plots. And then through those looking at those different versions can lead to a combination of elements that can kind of constitute into the class's grading. And once those combinations has happened, what is happening is throughout the courses, as you can see on the right side, of different aspects of their learning, different things and criteria that the class wants to focus on, is able to effectively visualize, and so the student able to see, the teachers able to see, and the other stakeholders are able to see how the one is doing throughout those processes itself. So the power of these types of tools that we're thinking, and then start getting different feedbacks from different educators, both in K-12 educators, along with college educators that we're able to find at the new school where Parsons School of Design is situated. It's getting really feedbacks on their ideas, using these types of prototypes as a artifact to elicit their thoughts and concepts. So these types of prototyping session has been powerful. These types of research prototype session have been useful to us in a sense that it's able to give us insight into whether this tool is going to be effective in actually classroom, along with a new concepts and idea that we did not think about from actual practice happening in classrooms, that we're able to get those stories and insight that could be incorporated into the future prototypes. So these types of engagement of artifacts and designs and prototypes, talking with people, engaging with people, as we're developing this tool, this participatory processes is really helping us to kind of guide the next step of the project, also make it more interesting. With that, Jessica, I'll hand it back to you.
Great, thank you. So I just want to briefly speak about the logic model that we are currently operating with. And so even with this tool being hypothetical at the moment, we still feel it's important to think about what inputs and outputs, what assumptions we're making, and what logic we're following. So we are assuming that regular engagement with a participatory community-based assessment tool would lead to more transparency around grading, more shared decision-making, a higher interest in participation, meaning if I knew that I was asked my opinion about what I wanted to be graded on, maybe there's more likelihood that I'm going to show up and feel like my voice should be a part of this class. What outputs would indicate those changes? We believe we would have the community agreements themselves as contracts, as evidence of a community coming together around a set of standards. We would have the assessment, what we're calling recipes, but they're really like differing rubrics. And we would have the artifacts associated with those rubrics. Then we think all of this would kind of contribute to the outcomes that we're looking for, which really, again, to reiterate, are around self-efficacy, belonging, and community building in the classroom. So I think that is the end of that portion of this session. And what I would love to do is to kind of open it up and invite you all to think about some of the things that we've shared here and maybe engage in a little bit of an activity. This is an activity that you could do on paper. It will be much easier if you do it online on the link that I'm going to share with you that's on the slide. But if you don't have access to being able to get to that link right now, then maybe paper will work for you. But essentially, we're asking you to imagine that you are a college student and you're in a course and it's the beginning of the semester and your faculty member is asking you and your peers to co-create a rubric that will be used to assess your performance. You're being asked your opinion about these things. And so part of this process involves negotiating how much weight is going to be given to particular aspects of your performance. So we're basically making a spider chart. So you'll see an example there on the right. That's what the Miro board is linked to as well. And we would love to get your feedback or have you think about how you would rank each of these categories. So the idea is that if something doesn't feel particularly valuable to you, you would rank it as a 1. But if it's something of great value, in your opinion, you would rank it as an 8 or a 9. So for example, if you think in-class participation should be weighted very heavily in your final grade, you might rank it as an 8, but maybe it's a 1. So we'll just see. Your objective, here's the tricky part. And honestly, if somebody asked me to do this right now, I might laugh. But here we go. Your objective is to create a path such that when you trace around this one time, it adds up to 80. So maybe part of what you're doing right now is just looking at these assessment areas and thinking about how you weight them. If you don't get to 80, that's okay. So we're kind of seeing this as like almost like a mathematical game. You're trying to create this visual that will like represent how you think you should be assessed. Everything is negotiable. So what I'm going to do for just 1 second is stop the slideshow and go to our Miro board. So hopefully you can see this. Let me know if you can't. And I've actually already done one example, and I see now John Key's playing with it on the Miro board. But what we're asking you to do is to play around with making your own assessment star or a shape based on how you would weight these different values. And again, if you don't have access, maybe you could draw it on paper. Yeah, John Key?
Yeah, I think one thing we can kind of add to using this kind of the playground that we made here is that how to move the spider is you don't have to move the line itself. Line is anchored to the little boxes here. So the idea is that you move these boxes around to different scores for each of these categories. Then you're able to do it well. Some of the trick is kind of hard to click because we're hacking this tool to make it work. Is really kind of trying to zoom in. If you're using the trackpad, you pinch your zoom it out, zoom in and zooming out to the thing. You click on that box and move to a different part, and then you can zoom out. And that could be kind of the trick to move these boxes to the scores that you're looking for.
That was great. Thank you. Yeah, we're definitely hacking something that we're playing around with this idea. I will say that if you're not able to get to the Miro board, I will leave this up on my screen for a minute just so you can kind of see the types of questions we're looking for as we're thinking about assessment. And one of the things that I wanted to point out is here. Again, as we kind of think about radically reimagining assessment, I put this question here. How you assess your teacher. Should that be how you as the learner assess your teacher? Should that weigh into your final grade? That kind of seems radical to me. Some other things are, I mean, this was very much written in the context of a design studio because that's the field I come from. Your spokes on your assessment may look way different than mine, but these are just kind of some of the areas we came up with to think about. So maybe we'll give people just like a couple minutes and they can play around with either the Miro board or if you want to sketch something out on a piece of paper that looks like this, or just play the game and see if you can get it to add up to 80. We have about maybe 3 or 4 minutes just to play around, and then we could come back and answer any questions and go from there. So maybe we'll just give you a couple minutes. All right, so I might just move us forward a little bit. Again, if you want to check out the Miro board, the link is there. It's tinyurl.com/assessment star. I don't know if what we made is an assessment star. We just gave it that name for some reason. But I'm going to just move us forward. Maybe you're still playing around with these ideas, but I wanted to conclude with a thought around another kind of model that is circle-based, which has been quite influential in the ways that I'm thinking about my teaching. And I know I shared it a lot in our research meetings. And that is the circle of courage. This model is something that comes from indigenous teaching practices. It was first described in a book called Reclaiming Youth at Risk, which was co-authored by Larry Brentro, Martin Brokenleg, and Steve Von Brokern. And this model integrates Native American philosophies of child rearing. And I find it to be interesting and wonderfully simple, but yet so deep. And so the ways in which I approach this is like any other kind of cyclical or circle-based representation. It has quadrants, much like the seasons or a clock or cardinal directions. The oppositional forces in the circle of courage, they are oppositional forces, but they also create a kind of balance. And I guess I'm wondering what it means to start from a place of balance. And as we think about maybe moving away from hierarchies and gridded ways of grading our students, what might it mean to start from a place where equity and balance and inclusion are really where we begin and end? And so I imagine in some ways, as we develop these tools and these prototypes, if we might even overlay the circle of courage over this prototype that we've created, this spider chart, you can imagine if the kinds of spokes that you create in your assessment were in line with some of these quadrants, you could kind of start to see how a learner or how a community of learners would start to pull in one direction. Do they feel a sense of mastery? Do they feel a sense of belonging? And maybe you as an educator could even start to wrap your head around your own teaching in these regards. So that's kind of where we're headed. That's like our work, what we're thinking about, what's influencing us. We have lots of questions. And Jianqi, did you want to share anything else to close us out too?
No, I think this has been great. We'd love to hear your thoughts. I know we're limited in terms of capacities, in terms of this virtual format, but if you're interested in participating in this research, or we can even open up for some questions right now. And also I'm going to put in the chat my email address for any follow-up that you're looking into.
Wonderful. So I'm not sure if there's any questions, or we're happy if you want to share anything in the chat. We're here.
I didn't capture any questions in the chat, but if you do have a question, please do type in the chat. Thank you.
And if there are no questions, maybe we just like say thank you so much. And here we are.
Jessica, we have a request from Audra. Thank you, Audra. Can I see the last slides again, please?
Oh, see the last slide? Got it.
Yes.
Feel free to let me know if there's a question about it. I'm sorry, I can't see the chat right now because I'm sharing my screen.
Audra, feel free to take a screenshot. And if you email us, we're also happy to share the presentation in PDF form as well.
Oh, I got too long.
Okay, I think that was all the questions that I'm seeing.
Great. These are our email addresses. Sorry, I forgot to share this. So I'll just leave it with that. And if there's any questions or anybody wants to be in touch with us, this is who we are, and we'd love to hear from you. And thank you.
Thank you.